So while my team, Man United, lost 4-3 to Bayern Munich, to make things even worse, Arsenal absolutely obliterate and dominate PSV, beating them 4-0. And PSV are a very good side. PSV are the best side in the Eredivisie right now. They have some very good, talented players, and they basically got obliterated. It was men versus boys. And look, I didn't watch a whole lot of the Arsenal game. It was more in the background while I was watching the United game. But I tell you what now, I wish I only watched the Arsenal game because it's not fun as a United fan. And I wanted to talk about Arsenal and could Arsenal win the Champions League? And I think, yes, I think Arsenal have more chance of winning the Champions League than the Europa League. And I'm going to tell Champions League than the Europa League, well, obviously, because they're not in the Europa League. Champions League than the Premier League this season. I'm going to tell you why. Chelsea won the Champions League in a season when no one really thought they would. Inter Milan and Spurs have recently made it to Champions League final. You know, we saw a semi-final with Napoli and Benfica that are good sides in. And I actually think right now there's only teams that I think are really better than Arsenal right now in the Champions League are probably Bayern Munich, Man City, and Real Madrid. They're probably the fourth best team in it. And we know that obviously the Champions League, knockout football, anything can happen. And with the way Arsenal are playing, with the fact that, you know, Arsenal look very, very good under Arteta and some of the players they have, and I think they've got much better depth, I think they could. We've seen Arteta win the FA Cup in his first season. We've seen him do many things. And we're going to talk about Arsenal, sort of do a bit of a review of the PSV game. Let's just talk about the players Arsenal have. And I have to say, Gabriel Jesus is a good player. He is some player. And I think, you know, him being back for Arsenal made a big difference. And as you can see, Saka, Trossard, Jesus and Odegaard all scored. And, you know, Arsenal, I wouldn't say they've been bad this season. A few people have said Arsenal have been bad or been playing average this season. I completely disagree. But this was definitely Arsenal's best and most exciting game for them. I think Arsenal had a good start to the season. They've only dropped points to Fulham. They've looked good. They have been pretty dominant in the games that they've won. But I don't think they were as maybe expansive and exciting as they were at the start of last season. But that might just be because teams now see Arsenal as a threat and they're playing a lower block against them, whereas PSV kind of went to the Emirates looking to play the attacking football they've been playing, and they kind of got destroyed. Now, I look at this Arsenal side and I think they look really good. And I thought against PSG, they look fantastic. I think there's many things that make a difference. And I said this when they signed David Raya, but David Raya is a very good keeper. I said before he went to Arsenal, David Raya was the second best keeper in the Premier League after Alisson. And I stick with that. I said it went Alisson, David Raya, Edison, and I got a lot of stick in like May from Arsenal fans when I said Raya is better than Ramsdale. And it feels a bit harsh on Ramsdale because he has been good for Arsenal. He did get them in the Champions League. But Raya is better than Ramsdale. And you can see that in the way Arsenal are playing. Arsenal building out from the back a lot better in their last two games. And, you know, I think Raya is just such a brilliant keeper. You've got William Saliba and Gabriel that are just solid rock pair. And the one thing that Arsenal have got now, and this is the reason I think Arsenal could win the Premier League, sorry, not win the Premier League, well, they could win the Premier League, but this is one of the reasons I think Arsenal could win the Champions League, is they've got something recently called consistency. And this is something Arsenal haven't had for a while. Well, Arsenal had a big problem with is being consistent. It would look good for a bit and then they'd drop points. But this last year, bar that little blink they had at the end of the season when Man City ended up winning the league, last year, Arsenal, you know, were pretty consistent. And this season, they have been consistent. Even when they're not playing at their best, they do get those 3 points. And one of the most consistent things about Arsenal is the core of their squad, which is Rice, Saliba and Gabriel. Those three players who are the core of the Arsenal squad have been unbelievably consistent. They've been rock solid. This Rice, Saliba, Gabriel little triangle core has been consistent. And I always think that is almost the most important part of your team. You know, if you, obviously scoring goals wins you games, but I always say this, if I was a manager and I was looking to rebuild a team, you start from the back, you go to the midfield, you go from the attack. Because the best back line midfield, little diamond there of DMs, 2 centre-backs, is the more control you have in the game. And the more control you have in the game, the less chances you are to concede, and the more your forward will likely get on the ball, which means your forward will have more chances to create. And I think Arsenal have one of the best cores right now. William Saliba is Rolls-Royce, Declan Rice is Rolls-Royce, and Gabriel is a very solid centre-back. So when Arsenal have got one of the best sort of cores in that midfield there, sort of midfield defensive core, that's going to give them control in game. That's going to give them stability. The only one that's really better that comes to my mind is obviously Stones, Diaz, Rodri. That is better than Arsenal. But you look at the youth in Arsenal's, they could be the best one in the next year or two. You know, Real Madrid have got a very good one as well, but for me, after Stones, Diaz, Rodri, I think Arsenal probably have the second sort of best, I almost call it that defensive core in football. So I think, that's going to be really big for Arsenal, that consistency. I do think they have good depth. Obviously, I know that Partey, Martinelli and Timber are all injured, but they will be back soon. I think Arsenal, dropped off the end of last season because they didn't have good depth. I actually think Arsenal's depth is pretty good. Trossard is their depth option. And I think he's averaged a goal or assist every 85 minutes for Arsenal. He's been absolutely solid. Partey is their depth option. And we know that Partey was arguably one of the most important players last season. Tomiyasu can do a job at right back. Obviously, Timber will be the depth option for right back, and he can also play in centre back, which is, I think, the Saliba injury is what cost Arsenal massively last season. Arsenal have got a very solid squad. Even players like Fabio Vieira, who didn't have the best first season, have really grown at Arsenal. And I think injuries is a big thing for Arsenal. If they don't get injuries, I think they could win the Champions League. I think Gabriel Jesus has been excellent for Arsenal. I think maybe long-term they do need a striker, but I look at Arsenal and I say they're probably at their best versus PSV. And I only watched glimpses of the game because I was crying over United and watched a little bit of highlights after. But they looked really good in build-up with Raya. Jesus made them look a lot better. This is no disrespect to Nketiah, but I don't think Nketiah is a good player, but I don't think you would start Nketiah week in, week out in a side that wins the treble. He's not Erling Haaland. Either is Jesus, but I think Jesus is better than Nketiah. I think Jesus is a good player, and although Jesus is not a natural goal scorer, he improves everyone sort of around him as well. You've got Trossard, who's looking great on the left wing, sort of that Arshavin kind of role. Martinelli's obviously a good player, but he is out injured, so they've got good options on the left wing. I think going into the summer, going into the transfer window, maybe they need a better depth option for Bukayo Saka is probably what Arsenal will look to get next, and maybe another striker because of Jesus' injury records. But that Arsenal squad, I hate to say it, it does look complete. And I think the big thing that Arsenal have that I'm very jealous of as a Manchester United fan is Saliba and Rice. Saliba and Rice are two of the best players in the world at their role. And they are so young and they are so good. They are so consistent. And the player that I wanted Man United to sign desperately was Rice and Timber. I said Declan Rice and Jurriën Timber will be two unreal signings for United. And Jurriën Timber is going to come back for Arsenal. And I obviously watched a lot of Ajax play. Man United were linked to Jurriën Timber. Then we got Martinez because of the whole situation with Van Gaal. But I've watched a lot of Ajax. I watched a lot of Ajax in those final few months when Timber and Martins were playing together, and I watched a bit of Ajax because obviously Ten Hag is linked to United. I do a lot of research on United. And Jurriën Timber is a fantastic player. He is absolutely unbelievable on the ball, absolutely unbelievable build-up. I think Arsenal are going to play him as an inverted right back, but his abilities at right centre-back, if something happens to Saliba, means that Arsenal will be okay. Because I think when something happens to Saliba last season, that's when they dropped off. I have to say, when Arsenal add Jurriën Timber to this side, they're going to go levels, Arsenal are getting their stride together. They're getting used to things. They're playing well. And, teams are just playing a more defensive block against Arsenal. Teams are just going, this Arsenal side's harder to beat. So they're being more cautious against Arsenal, which is why maybe they haven't looked as expansive the first few games. But I think if Arsenal get their stuff together, I think they could win the league. They could win the league, but I think they could win the Champions League. I still think there's more chance of them winning the Champions League just because of knockout football. I think Man City are too good to come close. And I think teams like Tottenham could be a threat in the league because they won't have European football or the Carabao Cup now. They won't have any distractions. I do wonder how being in all the cup competitions and the amount of games will cost Arsenal. We saw Man United have a really good period from about September to about February. And then Man United dropped off massively because they stayed in all 4 cup competitions. I think we played 12 more games than any other team last season. And I think that's impacting United a little bit this season. But I think, how they deal with depth, we'll have to see. But I think they've looked good and I don't like it. Smash a like, smash a subscribe. Be back soon. Bye.